So we're on air, but we have nobody in the room.
Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicola Solomon. I'm the Chief Executive of the Society of Authors. I'm a solicitor. Thanks for joining this session on using and protecting characters. It's the first of 6 sessions in the Brush Up event series in association with the Cartoon Museum and the Society of Authors Comics Creators Network, and part of our autumn-winter season, which is a 9-week program of online events which runs until tomorrow. Most of our events are free, but if you can afford it, we'd ask for donations to our Authors Contingency Fund. All money raised is used to support authors, illustrators and creators in financial difficulty due to health crisis. And we suggest a minimum donation of £5, and Nadia's going to put the links in the chat. And you can also browse our virtual Blackwell store featuring books by authors and speakers in our home festival. You can make a purchase during the links we'll give you. And again, by doing so, a percentage will go to the Authors Contingency Fund. And so anything you can do for us be helpful. Today's session is going to be a discussion between me and Joe Sullivan, the director of the Cartoon Museum, for about 40 minutes, followed by your questions for about 20 minutes. Thanks to anyone who sent in questions. If you want to submit them during the session, please type them in the chat section and we'll get to them if we can. If at any point you're having connection difficulties, press the reconnect button, which usually sorts it for you. I'm going to start by asking Joe to introduce himself and the Comics Museum before we get into the session. So, Joe.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name's Joe Sullivan. I'm the director of the Cartoon Museum. If you don't know who we are, we're a very small independent museum in the centre of London. Of course, due to furloughing and the museum closure and everything, I'm currently broadcasting from my daughter's bedroom, which is why there are dinosaur curtains behind me. So the Cartoon Museum, over the last year, despite going through a few issues, we've been trying to work towards being able to support artists a little bit more, work in collaboration with artists and support professional development. So this is a fantastic opportunity for the museum to partner with the Society of Authors and to run this session and the future sessions over the next year to support artists. So excited about that, and it's good to be here. Thank you.
So Joe, do you want to start asking me some questions, and that way we'll work out what your characters are and how you protect them?
Grand. Well, I think like the thing that probably unites almost all of tonight's audience is they create their own characters, and they also probably draw other famous characters. So Spider-Man or Dennis the Menace, people owned by big companies. So the best thing to do is to start, I think, looking at fictional characters. Now, a character that you might design or draw, they're made up of lots of different bits. There's the visual look, there's the backstory. I think it would be great to get a bit of an outline from you, Nicola, about how a fictional character is protected in law.
So it's not the easiest question. As you say, characters are made up of lots of bits and they're protected in different ways. And the question is what it is you want to protect and how. So if we take my friend Postman Pat, are you trying to protect this 3-dimensional character? And if you draw this picture, and you can see it by the amazing Joe Hickson Postman Pat, which I have, how is that Postman Pat the same as this Postman Pat? What is it you're protecting? So the area we always all start with is copyright, but characters themselves, Postman Pat, they're not protected in English law. Copyright protects the words and it protects the form in which you do things, and it protects the elements of style, the elements of the picture, but there isn't one thing to copy. And the type of copying traditionally envisaged by law, taking chunks of original text, if we're just starting by the descriptions, isn't what happens when you take a famous character and you put them in your book or you create a new comic strip for them. And English courts, for example, have several times refused to uphold copyright in the character of Sherlock Holmes, or they just said that isn't a concept in English law. Illustrations are a bit easier because it's easier to protect the elements, but even so, the copyright in each individual drawing will be there, but using a conglomerate of them to create that character and what they're doing isn't in itself protected. And, you know, and those two post and pats probably don't infringe copyright in each other.
Do you think there's a figure, you know, like a percentage almost of how much of someone else's work and these different pieces that, you know, come together to make a single character that an artist could use before it actually crosses over and becomes copyright infringement?
I mean, that's the question we're always asked. And the answer is, for something to be copyright infringement, you have to have used a substantial part. Mm-hmm. The slight problem is that law doesn't define a substantial part. And it's not just the words. So you've got to have used the words, the drawings, the settings, the plot elements, put them together, and then use a substantial part. But judges do work from the position that what is worth copying is worth protecting. So you might not need to have used very, very much to use it. There was an argument, for example, a long time ago about Lowe's Diary, which was a novel retelling Lolita from the young girl's point of view. And that actually ended with an agreement to share royalties. Most sequels, most fanfics just take original characters and create new situations for them. And quite often there aren't copyright elements which are infringed there. So it is a question of fact and degree. That's not very helpful. You probably need to ask someone. We used to actually check by telling people to go around the office with two pictures going, do you think these are the same? Because it is an ordinary person test. It's not a some expert test. So that works quite well.
I think that's an interesting kind of point. I think one of the things that I think is really important about these kind of events is to bring artists together to kind of discuss that. And I think that's maybe where the artist community can help out each other and be that kind of average person test, you know, and that check and balance. Because it does seem to me like there's a real difficulty in the law there. You can't define substantial part, you know, and I don't know if you have any examples or anything of what might constitute a substantial part in a particular case.
As I say, it's just really difficult, but it often is the thing that makes it distinctive. But I would usually start from the assumption that if you're ending up with the same feel, it's substantial. It's you know, there are so many legal cases on the whole thing. I'm going to apologize to people who are asking about my glasses reflecting on the screen. I tried for 15 minutes before we started to stop that. If I look more around at Joe, it'll be better. But if I end up with a crick in my neck, I'll have to look back. Okay.
This is the perils of Zoom. This is the perils of not being able to get everyone in a room, unfortunately. So one thing that's quite interesting that sort of sits to the side of what we've just been talking about is parody, because that has quite interesting sort of legal ramifications around it. And in a lot of cases, it's not covered by copyright, from what I understand. You can make a parody of someone else's work, and that's fine.
And that's right. In 2014, the law changed so that fair dealing with a work for the purposes of caricature, parody, or pastiche doesn't infringe copyright. And that's when we got a spate of books like these, where we have Where the Wild Things Are, you probably can't see this backwards, and Where the Wild Mums Are, or We're Going on a Bear Hunt and We're Going on a Bar Hunt. And so it isn't a parody, but it's interesting it's interesting you have to make sure. So this one, again, you probably can't see because I think it's backwards for you. It says a parody in great big letters underneath to stop them saying, and none of the pictures are actually the same. When we talk about characters and whatever, you look at the front of this and these, they are completely different. They're of the same kind, but they're not really copies. So people have tried quite carefully. And when We're Going on a Bear Hunt is an interesting one because the words of We're Going on a Bear Hunt weren't original anyway. So you could use the entire words because they weren't Michael Rose's words particularly, but you can't use all the pictures. So for parody, it's a matter of degree, impression, and so on in each case. But unlike copyright law, there is a bit of a definition because it says it's for limited, moderate use of another person's material. So the court will consider commercial factors and whether it affects the market of the original work. And one of the things we often say about characters particularly is that reusing them doesn't usually affect the market for the original work. In fact, fanfic probably helps sales of the original work, and that's helpful. It also, though, you have to be careful because it might not be considered appropriate if the first author wouldn't have liked it. So if in this one, if Michael Rosen absolutely hated drinking and was very against it, it might be considered inappropriate. And in 2013, in the European Union, there was a case where they disallowed the publication of a calendar which contained a reproduction of a drawing of the front cover of the Belgian comic Spike and Susie, which was in the 1960s, because the copyright owners were opposed to kind of racial implications of the parody. And they felt, well, we won't allow that. But I should say the European Union is very different because they as a whole feel that people's creations are much more personally attached to the creator, whereas here they're considered more commercial. And I should say the situation is also different in the States because their law contains specific sequel rights. So there was this book, The Wind Done Gone, which told the story from a slave's point of view, and that wasn't allowed because those are specific things. So again, everything I'm saying is about English law. Once you get in, which is problematic because all the work you're doing is probably going to be sold internationally, and something which is okay here may not be okay in another country. I'm not trying to put everyone off doing anything ever, by the way.
I think there's a really interesting kind of thread there about what essentially you can and can't do about, copyright and, essentially what changes can you make? And there's quite an interesting thing to dig into there. But I just want to quickly cycle back because I think your example with Where the Wild Things Are is quite an interesting one to me. Firstly, because I loved the book, that was my favorite book as a kid. But that's something you see quite a lot in almost like Waterstones and places like that. I wanted to just understand a little bit of how people come down on what is parody and what isn't. So I think the Bear Hunt, Bar Hunt, that is a really clear parody. You're taking a children's book, you're changing the artwork, but it's very similar, and you're changing the spirit of it and everything. Where it's something where the wild things are to where the wild mums are. I don't know I obviously don't know what Where the Wild Mums Are is. I don't know the context of the book, but I don't know if there's something interesting there about who would decide what the line on parody would be.
I mean, these are questions that we and other organisations all asked in 2012 before the law was made. We were saying you need to define it better because nobody knows what they're allowed to do. And in the end, it makes for great difficulty because you could ask the original author, but you're not really going to do that. You are trying to get sales on the back of something. How much are you going to win? And the only real legal case and fuss we know about it is, of course, the Ladybird issue, which happened before 2014, but I think it's still interesting. This book. Sorry, I told you I'd bring all my props. So you, like if you're my age, may remember the Peter and Jane reading learning scheme. This is Play With Us, book 1. And Miriam Elia put out this book under 1A called We Go to the Gallery. And you can see it's in the same style, but it's very, very different. And, it's quite funny. It's quite out there. It goes, is the art pretty, says Susan. No, says Mummy, pretty is not important. And what was really interesting is that PRH, who owned the rights, decided that they would take a claim against her for copyright infringement. And I will tell you later, because it will come into different bits, the things that they tried. But, is this parody? Maybe not really. I think probably it would come to parody. I think that people have a real sense that it's okay so long as you don't actually take too much of it. And as I say, mostly because it often helps the sales of the originals.
Okay. I think it's interesting. So I think let's kind of move on a little bit and kind of go back to the kind of point that I've taken us off by talking about where the wild things are. I think it'd be interesting to use about interesting to talk a little bit, sorry, about sort of length of copyright, you know, because obviously coming from a museum background, that's something that crosses over from museums to artists and all sorts of different disciplines where you're essentially using elements of or reproducing or whatever it might be other people's work. So I think that there is a hard and fast rule on how long copyright lasts, which would be, you know, good to hear a little bit about, and it'd be good to almost slightly sideways thinking about it, you know, at what point can I take the characters from Wind in the Willows and stick them on a tea towel and make money from them, or, you know, stick them in my comic book and have, I don't know, Judge Dredd exterminate them or whatever it might be. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay, so Wind in the Willows is a really good example for this. Copyright lasts for the author's life plus 70 years. But you have to work out who's the author. This is the real question, because the author might be the writer, but it might be the illustrator, and it might be both. And copyright lasts for the life of the creator plus 70. And in the case of The Wind of the Willows, Kenneth Graham died in 1932. So his work was out of copyright by 2003. But E.H. Shepard, who of course also did Winnie the Pooh, died in 1976 at the age of 97. So his illustrations are in copyright until the end of 2046. So if, for example, you wanted to use E.H. Shepard's, you know, and if, for example, you're doing something on Winnie the Pooh, again, Milne is, I think, now out of copyright, you might be all right with that, but you can't use the E.H. Shepard illustrations. But if you started using the Disney illustrations or other things, that's something else to think about. And there is a complicated piece of law about joint works. So sometimes illustrations and if you take something like Where the Wild Things Are, the illustrations and the text might be so considered one piece that it's considered a piece of joint copyright, and then that would wait till the death of the last one. Or it may be that the illustrations and the text have separate copyright, and you can use the part of it which is out of copyright. But as a general rule, I would take the view that if it's more than 70 years, it's in copyright. There are also some really strange rules about works which weren't published before the author died, but we won't go into that. But if anyone has that issue, please come to me.
And how about trademark things? You know, where an artist or an author has died, it's gone past the 70 years, but, you know, the estate has passed on to someone else, or it's been established. And how do trademarks affect that?
So if once things go out of copyright, one way that people try to continue protecting it is putting trademarks on it. It's quite an expensive thing to do, but it's worth it for something iconic. Like, for example, my friend Peter Rabbit. So you probably can't see this, but on the Peter Rabbit books, every illustration and now has in the corner a tiny thing, a tiny TM trademark, and on this Great Ormond Street label, it's also there for the merchandising. We've got Peter Rabbit. I stole this from the office, sorry, Catherine. And that will, if you renew it, you can renew it every 10 years, and then the copyright will last indefinitely. But you only get the trademark in everything you've trademarked. You'll get the trademark in the name, and I'll talk a bit more about trademarks in names and why they might help you later, and in each specific illustration. But what you won't, so you might have, you've got the trademark in this illustration, but it won't stop you taking the elements and making a different picture, because those are out of copyright. It's only these specifics which are trademarked. And the other thing is that there's lots of limits on what you can register as a trademark, and you quite particularly can't register descriptive names. So Grumpy Cat applied for a trademark in 2013, but only to protect the graphic image, because the name can't be registered because Grumpy Cat is descriptive. So so go on.
I was going to say, surely some names can be trademarked. You know, could I write a spell book and call it the Harry Potter spellbook? You know, surely some things can't be trademarked, or can be trademarked even.
So copyright won't protect names, and that's something I should have said before, because they're too short to get copyright protection as literary works. But trademarks can get protection. But the difference to remember between trademark and copyright is that they're there to protect different things. Copyright is to stop something being copied, the clue is in the name. But trademark is there as a mark of origin and to show that it came from someone else. And people ask about this lots of times. I know we have a question coming on later about using cars in your work, for example, which are trademark. If the trademark's there to show origin, so if by your having your work, you suggest it's somehow endorsed by the trademark owner, or it's from the trademark owner, then it's a problem. But it isn't a problem just to use a trademark name if you're not suggesting that you've got a connection with that trademark. So if I use the name Peter Rabbit, if I'm talking about, you know, Peter Rabbit came to my party, that isn't a problem unless I'm suggesting some type of connection. And again, you are asking about names. So just to go on to the other half of this, there are also what are called unregistered trademarks or passing off. And that's the same. If by suggesting that you're somehow endorsed or connected, then it's problematic. But because you're trading on someone's reputation, but if you're not trading on their reputation, it isn't a problem. So if you did the Harry Potter spell book, then that might well suggest it came from Bloomsbury or from J.K. Rowling and was endorsed by her. However, if you called it the unofficial, I mean, Harry Potter is in fact a trademark, but I assume it wasn't, the unofficial Harry Potter spell book by someone whose name is nothing like J.K. Rowling, and put it all over the cover, and especially if you put unofficial, there's not much they can do. And this comes back to why they've written a parody in big letters on We're Going on a Bar Hunt, because there are the two problems. They've got to make sure it's not a copyright infringement, and that's a parody. But on top of that, they've got to make sure they don't have a passing off case on the basis of, oh, we don't want anyone to think that this is a sequel in the same series. And what happened with Miriam Elia, and this, we go to the gallery, and in fact, is the second one was We Learn at Home, which for those of us under lockdown may become the go-to book, I think. You're not going to school today, Mummy is teaching us at home. And my favourite line in this, we are having a debate. How do you win? Asks John. You must tell the other person they are hurting your feelings, says Mummy. And what was her downfall in this is you can see it's in the same style and get up, the same size as the Ladybird books. So it may well have looked like it came from Ladybird. And she originally put the Ladybird trademark on the bottom. But after they complained, she then changed them and she called them the Dung Beetle reading scheme. And of course, Ladybird was trademarked. So originally it was an infringement trademark, but to change them to Dung Beetle reading scheme stopped it being a problem. It was clear they weren't emanating from there. She changed the names. She'd done all these drawings herself, and none of the drawings look exactly the same. It's also actually a lesson in what you need to do with copyright, because one of the reasons that Ladybird and PRH had a problem is because they hadn't kept proper copyright assignments for the original artworks anyway, so they didn't even know who the owners of half their copyright works were.
Something that's, again, interesting to pick up on, because it's a very vivid name, like Dung Beetle, you know, and it kind of makes me think there's got to be something within passing off about low quality, and it's something we sort of touched on earlier, and you know, we're kind of circling back to, you know, what kind of copyright infringement that might there be around taking another kind of person's design or characters that are unauthorized and they're making it really low quality, you know, say it's the quality of Dung Beetle quality, you know, it's really rubbish, or it's, you know, incredibly offensive. What kind of case for copyright infringement might be around that?
So it wouldn't probably add to the copyright infringement, but where it might be a problem is we have these things called moral rights, which are like ancillary to copyright. And if you subject somebody's work to derogatory treatment, which is almost the same as defamation, if it makes your reputation worse by looking at that work, then that is a possibility that you could take that claim independently. And I've certainly seen that where people have had their work used in a way which, you know, just would make people think the quality was really rotten and that it was connected with them. The other problem, though, and again, was for Ladybird with passing off, which I should just go back to. Unlike copyright, where you can stop people doing it if they've copied your work anyway, you can only stop people from passing off if you can prove you've had a financial loss. And the thing about these ones is that they took everyone back to the Ladybird book. And actually, as we were saying about fanfic, it often increases sales. And what was interesting then, of course, we then saw this huge set of, you know, like the midlife crisis, Ladybird putting out their own Ladybird books. Yeah. And actually, these became the highest selling books of the year. So everybody made a fortune out of this.
Interesting. We just had a question from Jude Ume about moral rights, and that kind of crosses over with that derogatory treatment. And it's not a sort of specific question, but I think the question I'd sort of draw out from that is, how would this be decided? You know, in practical advice to anyone sort of in the room, how would that kind of case around moral rights be decided?
So they're incredibly rare, actually, to go to court. And if people do take them to court, they tend to take them to court ancillary to a copyright infringement claim. They don't tend to take them on their own. I've occasionally seen them, mostly because the damages aren't very high. I've taken one or two in my life. I also, with another hat on, sit as a judge in the intellectual property courts. And we don't see them very often. Ditto, we haven't seen any of those parody defences or claims. They tend to settle. But there's something to add in to the damages, especially if you can't show a pure financial damage. And you see them thrown in, but you don't see them taken on. Where you do see them, though, are the other moral rights. The moral rights, not a derogatory treatment, but the moral right to be identified as the creator of the work. And that's really, really important. And in fact, applies to all of you who are drawing comics or whatever. That you do have a right to be identified as a creator. Of course, that's very valuable. We run a lot of schemes, you know, name the illustrator and all of those things, which pictures mean business, which make it clear that naming creators is really, really, really important. And as part of that, there is a place where we often will give damages for failure to credit.
Right, I see. Okay. So I think we talk quite a bit about the different elements that comprise of copyright, particularly of a character. And I think to draw it together, there was a nice question from Alan Dunn a little earlier, which is, can a character be protected as a trademark? And I think we've answered that as yes, and these are the different elements. But I think we've sort of looked quite, negatively is the wrong word, but we've looked at kind of all the dangers around trademarking. It'd be good to hear a little bit of practical advice for the audience about, how do you go about trademarking your own work? You know, you've seen the value of it. How do you go about trademarking that?
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a new character, I probably wouldn't do a trademark early on, simply, as I say, because you can trademark the name. You might want to do that. That's relatively simple. If you're going to trademark illustrations, all it will protect is that particular iteration of it, which isn't really, really going to help you. Trademarks are quite expensive. The process is quite slow. I certainly wouldn't do it at the moment because it's not quite clear how we're going to do it when we get out of Europe, and whether community trademarks are lasting and what we're going to do. So you might want to wait for a while. But I think there's a really good question in there about what you do to protect your work if you've created something you think is valuable, and that's really important. And I've touched on various elements of it as we've gone through. One is, make sure your work is properly documented. You know, as I said, that's what Ladybird did wrong. Always make sure you've kept copies of your drawings, you've kept copies of a character, you know when you made it, and you can prove that later. And then once you show it to people, and this is before it's published, there is one other right you have, which is confidentiality. People can't just, there's no copyright in an idea. But if you give an idea to somebody in confidence, they cannot use it without your permission. And a really good example of this, a case I was involved in some years ago, here. So this is a lovely picture by Susan Jenkins Pierce. And it's an illustration from one of the E. Nesbit tales. It's a short story. And Susie went to a publisher and suggested that they did a new edition of 4 old E. Nesbit stories. And the Nesbit stories are all out of copyright, and that she illustrated them. And what the publisher did was they put out a series of E. Nesbit stories, but they didn't use Susie as the illustrator. They used someone else as an illustrator. So what could she do? It wasn't copying her illustrations, and it wasn't, the works weren't copyright, but she could then, we told her she could claim breach of confidentiality. She gave them a valuable idea in confidence. And because of that, she was protected and they had to give her a royalty. And so what you need to do when you approach someone is make sure it's a situation of confidence. Ideally, you get a non-disclosure agreement, but a publisher will never sign a non-disclosure agreement. So you go to them and you send it with a covering letter going, this is a valuable idea. You cannot use it without coming back to me about it. And you have to be able to show later that it's your concept. It has to be quite a realized idea, but we see this every day because obviously lots of things are submitted and it's really, really, really important. And then if you've given an idea to a publisher or to anyone, a merchandiser, make sure you check carefully the contracts offered, make sure you come into the Society of Authors contract checking service. Consider what rights you give. There are lots of rights with characters. It's not just the one strip, the book. If you think they're able to do that, but they're not able to make these lovely, pictures, registered design, don't give that. Someone who did become a very famous character who I once acted for, put theme park rights in their contract. Decide if you're going to give the theme park rights.
Well, that was the famous thing in Star Wars, wasn't it? George Lucas kept all the merchandising rights. Worked quite well for him.
Exactly. And you might want to keep the rights to spin-off books, such as colouring and pop-up books. Also be careful if the publisher is going to help you develop the character. And this is the same if you're asked by a publisher to help develop something. Make sure the contract tells you who's got the rights. Very often, if a publisher asks you, you'll have to assign them the copyright. But there may be some rights that you can keep. But plenty of those, and make sure also that you have the right to stop them using spin-offs and so on, because merchandising and merchandising licenses are just really, really important. And another one that I did a case on many years ago was a bit relevant. So what do you think this is?
I think that is Rupert Bear.
Well, no, because this was sold as Trousers Bear. But they really suffered because Rupert did actually have, Rupert as we see is very similar, except different now, did have all sorts of registered design rights, and therefore we got Trousers Bear taken off the market. But you have to be really, really careful on all of these things.
Okay. One quick follow-up to that is, in a really, really kind of simple way, there must be ways you can get something down as copyright. One of the things I remember hearing years ago is that musicians used to write the sheet music out and post it to themselves. Are things like that valid?
They absolutely are. And we always used to tell people to write it and post it themselves. The thing is, these days with computers, it's actually mostly within the machine. They will have dated them anyway, and so it's fine. Or you can email it to yourself or whatever. It's not. It's it's much easier now. We're doing things digitally than it used to be to prove when you made things.
Yeah. Okay. So let's kind of move along a little bit, because we've sort of talked quite a bit now about fictional characters, and I think we should move more onto kind of real people, the kind of real world stuff. So if I wanted to put real people into my work, if I wanted to use real historical facts, and we've had a couple of questions that kind of sort of feed into this. So we had a question from Jess One: what if you're drawing a character with branded clothing? We had a question before the event started from Matsu Matsano about what's copyright around using events and championships like Formula One, NASCAR, using real cars from various media. How can you approach that? How can you make sure you're not breaching copyright? How can you use brands, real historical situations and facts without essentially breaking the law? problems arise, and how do you get around them?
So there's two bits. There's the brands, which we've really talked about anyway, which is if you have a brand and if you can use it, you can refer to it and talk about it, so long as you're not doing it in a trademark sense and using up their trademarks. And mostly you won't be. With trademark clothing, it's also normally fine. There may be problems, but ask about that. With historical characters, of course, there is no copyright in historical character. There's also no copyright in historical facts. You can refer to those as much as you like, whether they're alive or dead. You can refer to people, and you can make them do things in your books. I think it's a good idea to make it clear it's fiction, because I think there's things that are morally right to do anyway, but mostly it's completely fine. And as I say, using facts, even if you use them from other people's books or research, isn't a problem if you don't use the actual wording. I mean, it's not just the wording, but the copyright is in the original expression. And the original expression means the language in which it's composed, the selection, the arrangement, the compilation of raw material. But it doesn't extend to the facts themselves, even if you've done a lot of research. So we had an interesting case called Ravenscroft and Herbert, which was a very old case, which is the copying of a substantial work of non-fiction, The Spear of Destiny. The Spear of Destiny, for some reason, all these cases are always around Jesus. I don't know why, because we had the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, but this one, The Spear of Destiny, has a theory that the spear that was used to kill Jesus lasted all through the generations and was owned by Hitler and had special magical properties, and therefore meant that he could have won the war if it wasn't taken away.
He owned the Ark as well, so he had it all set.
Exactly, all of these kind of things. But so what happened was someone took this Spear of Destiny fact and put it in a work of fiction, but they used about 50 instances of of language copying and copying the same historical characters, the same historical incidents, the same interpretation of the significance of those incidents in the same order, and that was copying. But it's not copying if you just, say somebody was born in 1932 and you got that from somebody's biography. And then the other problem with using real people, because we've had those questions, are defamation. So, giving you a one line on defamation. First of all, and this is something to really remember, you cannot defame the dead. It doesn't matter if their relations don't like it. If you say something rude about somebody and they're dead, it's not a problem. But if they're alive, I mean, it might be a problem on all sorts of other issues, but it's not a legal problem. But if they're alive, and if what you say would lower them in the estimation of right-thinking people, then that could be defamatory. So if you do put someone, to dinner with someone else, probably not defamatory. But if by doing that you suggested somehow that they were doing something a bit unfair, or they were being, particularly hypocrisy, the courts hate hypocrisy. So if you see, I don't know, a politician going to dinner with someone they hate who's been saying their worst enemy or whatever, then you might have defamation, if people really think it's true, because it's got to lower them in the estimation of right-thinking people generally. If it is clearly a fantasy, it's probably not a problem.
Right, okay. So we had a couple of questions in advance, so I'll just give you a couple of really quick fire ones. These are from John Clark. Is it permissible to state that real people met or taught fictional characters?
It should be absolutely fine. So it's not defamatory. People normally love that kind of thing, so long as, again, you're not giving away any secrets on which privacy, but, so long as you haven't done real stuff like that makes people think differently about them, it's usually fine.
And is it permissible to put words into the mouths of real people that they didn't say?
Again, I think it's good practice to make it clear it's fiction, but so long as it's not defamatory, you can basically say anything.
Yep, that's good. I mean, I think that's an interesting clause to say, is that maybe you need to flag up that the whole work is fiction, and there's plenty of, particularly books and things, that you'll find that in the front covers. Films obviously is a great example. this is based on real events or inspired by true events. So there's always those kind of disclaimers there. So, I mean, I remember a while ago reading a Deadpool comic that had Hitler in a robot suit coming back from the past and all this crazy stuff going on. And, you know, I don't think Hitler was really a robot man, but I don't think it counts as defamation. So it's clearly fine.
Exactly. And what's been interesting to watch The Crown, and lots of these questions around, you know, clearly those people did not say those things. But that's generally fine, and they generally can't sue. I mean, the royal family don't tend to sue anyway, but they generally can't sue unless it's defamatory or unless it would be an invasion of their privacy. And in fact, the one complaint I think did come across about The Crown this time was they showed the funeral of Prince Charles's friend who died in an avalanche, and they showed, I think, his pregnant wife, in the fact that I think she really complained and said, actually, you know, yeah, you know, basically that really wasn't tasteful and it was completely unnecessary. And yeah, okay, it wasn't private information, it was public information, but it probably wasn't the best use of things either.
I know there's been a lot of back and forwards on The Crown, obviously, and I don't know, from what I understand, it's a pagan making a fuss about the royal family. So it's just, you know, a good way to sell papers. And a kind of extension to this, another question from Alan Dunn. Can you use diaries or memoirs of historical people? And I assume this is in fiction. Again,
you know, so first of all, if those diaries or memoirs are in copyright, then you will still have, and so it's less than 70 years since they died. Obviously, you would need to get permission from their estates. We have that quite a lot. But there's no reason otherwise why you couldn't use them if you've got the permission to use them and use the real words. It's the kind of mashup that people do all the time these days and works really, really well. But you would need the copyright permissions.
Okay. And this is another interesting extension, I think. This is from David Adams, another question. Can you talk about the proliferation of a meme universe where a character created by an artist becomes widely distributed by others on the internet without the permission of said artist? And it's quite an interesting one because it's kind of running the lines between copyright on art and reproduction and also real life. You know, that's essentially taking a real life thing and which is using art. And I don't know, there's something really weird about that concept that's quite interesting to dig into.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating because people do think that the internet is a copyright-free zone, and it isn't, you know, and many, many memes are infringements of copyright. And one of the things that I haven't talked about that you have to think about when you're using work is anybody going to complain? And and does the person who's going to complain have deep pockets? Because you know what? If you use a Disney character, even if actually you're perfectly entitled to do it, but Disney sue you, I suspect that they've got more means to keep going and to push you and push you and push you till you give up than you have. So you know, is it worth it? One of the cases we see all the time, and you may have had this, is that there are people now who use image search to crawl the internet. Whenever they find their images used in an unauthorized way, they'll sue or they'll ask for money for them. And many photographers I know are now making a pension from just those unauthorized, very minor uses of their work, often actually because that work was illustrating an article and, you know, reproducing it is a straight infringement of copyright. If people ask you to stop, they do. And people say that maybe all the time, but everybody's doing it. It's like, doesn't make it right, doesn't make it okay. And memes, you know, have no copyright exemption. They might come into parody, but would it be a fair use? Probably not quite often.
I think that's a really useful piece of advice because obviously a big kind of complaint and issue you hear, particularly sort of lower profile artists talking about, is the fact people ask to use images for free, and then those images, even if you give them in good faith or whatever, then they become displayed all across the internet and then taken and used for other things. I suppose that's a nice practical piece of information to say, well, if you did have that agreement with someone, you've still got the right to go and follow up with all of the other unauthorized uses and make some money back from those, I guess.
That's right. And you should also think about what you give permission for, whether you make sure that people have all the metadata incorporated in it. Perhaps ask people to link to your own website rather than put it on their websites. Perhaps only allow low resolution uses or watermark them, so it's clear that people have to come back to you. And it is actually a criminal offence to strip metadata from an image or from words. So because it's so important that you should be able to get back, find them. But also there is really good image search software out there now, and worth thinking about whether it's worth you, whether it's worth you paying someone to do it. It's not very expensive, and to keep a watch for every time your work is used, and then just make claims. Because sitting in the small claims track, those are the claims we see all the time, and people are earning a lot of money from following up uses of their work.
So we talked about, obviously, fictional characters. We've talked about real life characters. There's another question that's come in, which is quite interesting, that rides the kind of middle ground of those two things, which is from my good friend Dan Digby. Are there copyright issues or complications around characters in fairy tales and folklore, or adapting characters like Shakespeare did with King Lear? So it kind of straddles the two, doesn't it?
So the answer to that is luckily no, because most of those characters are, would be way out of copyright. And you saw, I think, Philip Pullman redid Grimm's Tales. People often do those. The masses of mythology and Greek mythology that we've been seeing out now. We used to have a running joke that you couldn't copy the Bible because God isn't dead, so it's still in copyright. But then the question was, how is he going to sue? So you're probably okay. But realistically, it's fine to use them. But the other side of it is make sure you're not using a version which is still in copyright, because someone will have put their own adaptation, their own words and whatever around it, and that's a bit like what we about with the bear hunt. That this is old traditional fairy tale, but once you get to exactly the wording that's been used in this by Michael Rosen, you might be infringing his copyright.
So use the Norse god Thor instead of the Marvel mighty Thor.
Exactly.
So one final thing to move on to before we start to take some questions to finish off the session. You sort of mentioned earlier about the law being different between the UK and other places. I mean, the very broad question is the law and everything you've told us the same everywhere? And we've delved into a few nooks and crannies, so I don't know if that's something you want to try and expand on a little. And also, kind of to follow up and pair with that is a question from Rachel Nicholson. Is defamation of the dead an issue in countries outside the UK? So if a book is published in the UK and translated and published abroad. So it'd be good just to finally hear a little bit more about how UK law might then tally with law in other countries.
So I'm not a world expert on every area of law, but as I understand it, defamation does not extend to the dead in any country, and indeed the same is true of privacy normally, because we haven't talked much about privacy, but that's normally true as well. There are some countries which are much less tough on privacy than the UK, for example America, because of the First Amendment. There are some which are much more tough, like the European countries, which tend to be really, really fussy about privacy. So these are all, interesting areas. So, but the fact is, there is no international law on almost anything, and you do have to look and see. Copyright law is pretty much aligned in many areas, but moral rights are different in every country, and America doesn't have moral rights at all. And also just all the copyright exceptions, all those parody exceptions are different in every country. And there's just, and in fact, copyright term is different. So we're doing a case at the moment over one of the estates that we have, which is for Forster, which is still in copyright in the UK, but isn't in copyright in America. So, it is worth checking, but then if you're doing it yourself, obviously you have to check yourself. But you would expect a publisher to do these things for you if you've got a commercial publisher as well.
Okay, great. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of our sort of main chat, I think. I'll just give you one kind of final opportunity to, reinforce anything you think would be particularly useful advice, or anything else that you feel that we didn't cover that would be really essential. And we've had questions sort of flooding in throughout the chat, so I'm going to return to some of the ones I haven't covered yet. So if you want to take another minute or so, if there's anything else you'd like to cover, and then we'll start to go through some questions.
Well, I'll answer questions, but the thing that I think is really best to say is, first of all, use your imagination, create characters, don't feel constrained by the wealth of everything else out there. Be inspired, use it, and then think about how to deal with it later. Secondly, don't try to remember everything I've said, because you never will be able to, but remember in the sense of that it triggers. What I'm trying to do in the session is that when you use something, it triggers you, so you think, didn't that woman say something about that? I better go and get some advice. And and we are there for you for the cost of your Society of Authors membership. We will answer any question, however basic, at any point. So just go and check, and we can always look over things. But and then finally, don't come and ask us about the law before you've looked at whatever that place's attitude is to doing things. So, for example, song lyrics. Loads of people are really, really fussy about song lyrics. You don't want to have a fight with a big American corporation about song lyrics, whether they're right or not. So just think about that and the commercial use of it as well.
Okay, great. So we'll start with a question from Tita Barredo. What is your views about the case of the alleged plagiarism of John Lewis's Christmas advert in 2017 on Chris Riddell's Monster from Mr. Underbed?
I mean, I think that is, there have been several of these. I think every year, a really, really good example of pictures looking the same, but is it just a similar idea, or is it close enough that it's actually an infringement? And what you really need to do is look at copyright is all about detail. You have to look at the two together, piece by piece, and work out whether you think it's close enough that it's a straight copy, or whether it's enough to get away with. And that one, to my mind, looked quite on the edge, but you'd really, really need to examine it to take a final.
Okay. Question from Jillian Stokes. I had an idea used years after suggesting it to a TV company. Do I have any redress?
The question on these ideas, formats, whatever, are quite complicated. Mostly, as I say, there's no copyright on ideas. If something's given in confidence, you might have rights, but it has to have been developed enough to be commercial and detailed and saleable. So the big case about it is the Rock Follies case, which was people suggested to the ITV the idea of running a drama about an all-women pop group, and they did it with different people, but they'd used enough of the really quite detailed plot elements that were given for them to be able to show that that was an infringement of that format. Just to say, I think I'd like to do, it would be great to do something about a cat, is not going to get you there. So if you had it very, very well documented, and if you can prove they can use it, and if you can prove how it got to them, it is possible. I once had a great case that I dealt with where this person told me that they had psychically sent the ideas for, and then there was a list of literally every top film of the year to the companies, and could they sue them? And I was like, no, unfortunately you can't. And then they complained about me to the Law Society, saying I wasn't helpful.
That's handy, because I have the same issue at the moment that I thought all of the Oscar winners 2021.
Exactly.
This question's from Kirsten Hall. I once wrote a story for my kids which featured a villainous and unscrupulous property developer, only to be told by one of my sons he'd found from a quick Google search that someone with the very same name really existed and was a property developer. With the standard disclaimer of, this is a work of fiction and any resemblance to persons living is purely coincidental, cover me and protect me from being sued for defamation.
No, and that's a great example. And defamation is, I didn't go into this, but it allows me now to tell you about my favorite cases in fiction, which are really worrying. And the first one is what we always call the sad tale of Artemis Jones. And this was a case where somebody wrote a story about a fictional church warden and said, and wished, there is Artemis Jones walking along with a woman who's not his wife, who must be, therefore, the other thing. And there was a real church warden called Artemis Jones, who lived in Wales, who didn't have anything other similar, who sued for defamation, who said all his friends thought it was about him, and who won the defamation case. And the second case, again, just in case you think that was completely a one-off, was about Harold Newstead, the 30-year-old Camberwell man who'd been caught for bigamy, and in fact said, it brilliantly said, and they were all keeping quite fine until the police interfered, but and the newspaper's printed Harold Newstead, 30-year-old Camberwell man. Unfortunately for them, there was another Harold Newstead, 30-year-old Camberwell man, very well-known local barber, not the same one, also sued for defamation because people could think it was him. So it's really, really problematic. And that's why quite often in fiction, you see people using really strange names. We strongly suggest you look up the electoral register, and we strongly suggest that you use enough defining characteristics that nobody could possibly think it was the same person. So if you've got a property developer with the same name, and this person really is unscrupulous or whatever, then you really do run the risk that their friends will think it's based on them. Equally, you have to also be careful with being too specific, because if you use a whole lot of very specific physical characteristics but a different name, so that people, and the facts are the same, so that people think, oh, that's probably based on me, or all their friends would think it was based on them, it can be defamation. The good news with defamation is that our defamation rules have been quite seriously changed, although not in Scotland, to mean that there's now a serious harm test. You have to prove serious harm, and that people have to sue within 1 year of publication. So defamation isn't as big a worry as it used to be, but I would still always check names. And if you are using a particular profession, check in that professional register that you haven't got the name of someone who is already one of those things. It's a really good question.
Next question from Yael Biran. If I gave a client my working files and we didn't sign a contract, is it basically understood that I gave them the rights to use it for other reproductions? It's kind of what we're talking about images flying out across the internet with no control.
So the answer is, that would so depend on the circumstances, but it isn't a great idea, and that's why whenever you give anything to clients, you should be really, really clear about what their uses are, and be as limiting as you can. You may not think it's worth anything to you now, but it may well be later. So whenever you give a license, it should be for this many reproductions. You can use it for editorial only, but not for commercial use. Just explain. It doesn't take long, and try and make sure you do that at the beginning, not at the end.
Okay. I think we've got time for one more question. So we'll have this quick one from Sarah Sky Craig. I use a few inspirational quotes and a couple of verses and chorus of famous songs as part of a couple of chapters. I credit the original authors and put in the quotes, but is this enough? If
it's modern pop music, I would seek permission. There are, again, like I was talking about with photographers, lots and lots of record companies are really hot on this. And of course, when we're talking about copyright and how much can be protected, it's true that a few words can't be protected, but if it's very clear it comes from the original song, then probably it is enough to be protected, because they are the hooks, they are the bits that actually, hold the copyright for you. And they're really hot on it. So I would seek permission. The problem that you'll find with seeking permission is that often people don't get back to you, they're really slow, but lots of people now do have automated systems for seeking permission. So I wouldn't use it unless you're sure it's okay. And also be just things you can be caught out on, like happy birthday is still in copyright.
Yeah, I've heard that, yeah. And I'll just add to that we, within the museum, we've got a big exhibition that we're hoping to come up in February. We're currently in negotiation still with Warner Brothers and DC Comics. And it's because they're these big companies, they do have a slow process, like you say. There's a lot of kind of boxes to tick, and they want to see absolutely everything before they can sign anything off, and it goes up the chain and up the chain. And I think it's a good point to sort of think, if you've got to, contact those, or you're putting yourself in a position where you have to contact those companies, you really need to have everything prepped. So if you've got any kind of deadline, you need to be doing it really, really early and giving as much information to those people as you can, because it could take a long time to get back.
And Stacey makes it, I was being a bit casual in my words, but Stacey quite rightly points out that the license you use from a music publisher not from the record label. If you're using words. Thanks, Stacey, another lawyer watching me.
Thank you, Stacey. Okay, I think that is our time. So I will say thank you for having me, and thank you for taking part, Nicola, and I'll hand back over to you to finish off from the Society of Authors.
Well, you know, just thanks for everybody. Nadia has commented that we can rewatch this event and all our past events on our Vimeo channel, so please do. I think our next event is that we've got an event tomorrow morning on Industry Insider, the role of a literary agent. And in the afternoon, you've got double bill. In the afternoon, we've got afternoon tea with Dean Atta. So please do come along to those and to book them. The next event in our Brush Up series will be now 27th January for Memories, certainly around then. It's going to be in conjunction with the Arts Council, and it's going to cover how to get funding for your work. So lots of different ways that you can get funding. And huge thanks to you, Joe. It's been a really fun session. And huge thanks for everybody to come along. And don't forget to use our advice services and to send any questions into us at the Society. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, everybody.